Welcome to the station, Kentucky's Conservative Outpost, the only program in the state of Kentucky that deals with news and politics from a conservative perspective. So we want to thank you for being on the program, and we have a cool show today because we're going to talk about Kentucky, and we're going to talk about the different regions of Kentucky and how they think and how they react and how they vote, and you know, every part of the state is a little bit different. They have a different history, different heritage, and you know, you look at any region of the world, and there's different cultures, subcultures, and Kentucky certainly has that as well. So we're going to do that with a wonderful guest, John Hodgson. He's a state rep of State Rep District 36, and here in Eastern Jefferson County, and which is in the J-Town area. And he's very well versed in all things state politics. He's actually served in the Bevan administration prior to his tenure as a legislator, and then before that worked at UPS as an airline. Well, you'll have to explain that. Something with UPS and the airline aspect of UPS, which is a great industry for this city, and so you're definitely plugged into who we are as Kentuckians and as Louisvillians. So we also have Bob Scott on the line. Bob's arranged this interview today. So, and thanks for being on the call again, Bob. So, cool. All right, let's talk about this. So, I'm going to pull up a website. Will, if you can put this on the screen. There's a article that came out a few years ago called "The 11 Separate Nations of the United States," and if you look at this closely, it basically highlights the different regions of the U.S. based on sort of cultural and demographic aspects. So, and if you look at right here in the middle, right where the words Greater Appalachia is written, that's of course the state of Kentucky. And Greater Appalachia is this region from sort of the Appalachians west all the way down to Texas, oddly enough. So if you ever wondered why people in Kentucky can kind of relate to people in Oklahoma and Texas, because we're all part of the same people group. We kind of migrated from the Appalachians down to the Southwest, and it's, so there we go. So that's, we have certain ways of looking at the world, certain politics, we crave freedom, and we're kind of suspicious of big government, and so it's, you know, where you go up in the Yankeedom, and the very, go back to that map, the Yankeedom in the United States, they're a little bit more friendly to government. They kind of like, you know, they like big government. They just have different aspects of, because they come from a different cultural background, and a lot of people in Greater Appalachia we were Scotch-Irish. We didn't trust the English. You know, they kind of treated us bad, and so we kind of carried over that instinct from then. So, but of course the English Puritans that settled in Yankeedom, they kind of liked the Puritan aspect. They set up this Puritan culture and a government, and so it's, you know, there's different reasons why people sort of react the way they do about things political, and part of it is their culture and their background. So Kentucky's no different, and we have a quasi-expert on this topic with John Hodgson. So John, let's talk about Kentucky. There's obviously different regions of Kentucky. There's Eastern Kentucky, there's Central Kentucky, there's, you know, the Lexington and Louisville, of course, Western Kentucky. You know, so how would you divide up the state culturally and regionally, similar to what this map did?
So Kentucky has an interesting history going back to the 1700s. We were the first non-Eastern Seaboard state, the first state over the mountains, you know, Daniel Boone and all that. So it was a state of pioneers. Kentucky was very influential in national politics up into the 1830s and 40s with Henry Clay. And was largely settled, as you mentioned, by Scots-Irish people coming down from the Appalachians. It looked like their home country, and they were religious people. They were tight-knit social groups, and distrustful of big government, because I've got some Scots-Irish ancestors that were dispossessed of their land in the 1700s and made their way over here. But the Eastern Kentucky voting bloc tends to have very tight-knit communities, very church-oriented, a lot of Baptists, a lot of Pentecostals, a lot of cultural similarities, and they tend to vote on values issues, religious issues. You know, some people might describe that part of the state as being almost a pro-life Democrat, if you will. They're comfortable with some government programs that assist low-income people, but they also do not want the government curtailing their religious liberties in any way. So I think, politically, the key to Eastern Kentucky is you've got to make a connection with the religious community and with the churches, and understand their unique needs and unique topography. That part of the state remained in the Union and remained free in the Civil War. As you move farther west, while the state of Kentucky stayed in the Union, it was a slave state. There were not a lot of slaveholders, hardly any slaveholders in the east. They were in the western part of the state and around Louisville. So that was a heavily Democrat area. That was a river culture that had been settled by the French going back to the 1600s. Memphis, St. Louis, Louisville, on up to Cincinnati. Those were all river culture towns. Louisville was a slave market. So Louisville's got a heavy Democrat presence that goes back hundreds of years, and is an urban culture. And I would say Cincinnati and the northern Kentucky area that are just south of the river there in south of Cincinnati are also an urban culture. It's a dense population. The key to that area, which I'll say includes Louisville and northern Kentucky and Lexington, is commercial interests. It's called the Golden Triangle. That's the economic engine that drives the state. So you've got to have good fiscal policy to win in that sector in an election. But breaking down a little farther, there's really three subsets in the Golden Triangle. Northern Kentucky has a lot of extreme political opinions, and that ethnically is different than Eastern Kentucky. They are predominantly French and German ancestry in that area, and it's probably the sharpest divisions I see politically in the state between what you call country club Republicans, Tea Party Republicans, establishment Republicans, is right there in northern Kentucky. Neighboring districts, people are frequently at great odds and disagreement with each other about what some other people would consider less important issues. So there's always a lot of controversy and a lot of argument in northern Kentucky. You move out west, you got a lot of farmers, probably most of the area west of Louisville. And for the most part, they are somewhat socially conservative. They're somewhat politically conservative. They just want to run their life, run their business, run their farm, and be left alone. They don't want the government interfering in their lives. So you don't typically get a lot of drama in western Kentucky. And then you've got south central Kentucky, which is probably more similar to the way the Louisville area votes, but there are some kind of a hybrid of the other areas there. That part of the state gets drawn into Tennessee a little bit and emulates that Tennessee culture. But it's very hard as a candidate to go, a statewide candidate, to all go with the same message to all those places and be successful. You've got to tailor your message to those demographic differences and to their policy differences. You've got to have strong social conservative positions in Eastern Kentucky. You've got to have a strong economic policy in the Golden Triangle. You've got to be able to speak to the Baptists and Pentecostals in Eastern Kentucky, but be able to speak to the Catholics in Louisville and Northern Kentucky. And there are areas of overlap, but the audiences are quite different. And like I say, Western Kentucky, the only political event anybody knows about is Fancy Farm. And there's just not a lot of squabbling in Western Kentucky. So typically in a statewide race, you'll see 110 of our 120 counties go red, somewhere thereabouts. And the big blue islands are going to be Louisville and Lexington, and then around Bowling Green, and then maybe a spot or two in northern Kentucky.
Yeah. So the areas west of Kentucky, or west of Louisville, and so basically west of the Golden Triangle, and then all the way to the Panhandle there, that's all considered one sort of cultural demographic region?
More similar to the rest of the Midwest, and it was the flat arable land in Kentucky, and that's where, prior to the Civil War, that's where your slaveholders were.
Okay, interesting.
They buy slaves at the market in Louisville, and actually, if you recall, during the Civil War, West Virginia was free and split off from Virginia, which was slave. The Eastern Kentuckians were Republicans and stayed very loyal to the Union, whereas the Western Kentucky people centered in Louisville were Democrats.
Yeah, interesting.
And so I think Kentucky actually got invaded. Louisville got invaded by Indiana, during the war, and I think the South actually came and invaded parts of eastern Kentucky, and those wounds ran deep and did not heal after the Civil War was over. And in fact, a guy that was elected governor in 1899, Goebel, had actually shot a Civil War general from the other side in a duel in the street in northern Kentucky. And he contested the election of 1899, and it was 1900. There were armed men in the streets of Frankfort. Came in on the train from eastern Kentucky. They camped out in front of the State House. And after several weeks of that, and people dying in the streets and saloon fights and things like that, Goebel was actually assassinated out of the Secretary of State's window. A guy served time for it. Nobody still to this day is quite sure who did it. But while he was lying there dying, the legislature felt sorry for him and swore him in as governor, and stuffed a pen in his stiff hand and had him sign a couple of executive orders, and then he passed away. Only governor in America to ever be assassinated. So that was wounds that were carried over from the Civil War. So I think some of that is still present in our Kentucky culture, and why the East doesn't trust Louisville and vice versa.
The controversy then was political interest of eastern Kentucky versus the political interest of what, the Golden Triangle primarily, and then and the Western Kentucky kind of sat out and just watched the. Okay, well that's fascinating. I've heard of that story in bits and pieces, but please.
The state legislature actually fractured, and the Republicans went and assembled in London, Kentucky, and the Democrats retreated to Louisville, and they couldn't make a quorum in Frankfort.
Wow.
And they had to do some high-level political maneuvering, swear in the lieutenant governor as governor, and sign executive orders to send the militia home in order to get a quorum in the State House in Frankfort to do business.
Wow, that's fascinating. So this whole call for breaking up states and having conflicting interstate issues is not new to this country. I think of Oregon right now, with the Greater Idaho movement, where 2/3 of the geographic area of Oregon wants to break off and join Idaho because they're all the rural Oregonians are tired of these woke leftists in Portland that are running the state. And so, there we go. So this is not new. Kentucky's had some similar experiences.
In fact, our Declaration of Independence says that people have the right to, select the type of government that suits their preferences. And
That's
can
right.
overthrow the shackles of the government. The Kentucky Constitution, it says that people have that right as well. So, it's not a new thing. It just hadn't happened for about 120 years, not since West Virginia split off from Virginia, I guess.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Well, I see some of that here in the future. But, this is great. So okay, well, let's talk about the current political climate in Kentucky. And right now, the big story is we have a governor's race. We're in the middle of a governor's race with Daniel Cameron and Beshear being the incumbent. So how do these candidates address their messaging for each one of these, and how are they addressing their message for each region of the state? And Bob, after I'll let you follow up with the next question on this. I don't want to steal the show here, but how would Cameron speak to Northern Kentucky versus Eastern Kentucky, for example?
Okay, well, I think Daniel Cameron, being a man of deep faith background, can converse very well with people in Eastern Kentucky. He can, speak the language of, evangelical Christians, and that comes naturally for him. I think they align with him on social issues, and I think Eastern Kentucky counties are going to overwhelmingly vote for Cameron, as they have in the last, voted for Republicans in the last several statewide elections. I think his biggest challenge is going to be in Louisville and Lexington, where in the 2015 race, I think Bevin lost Lexington by around 40,000 votes and lost Jefferson, Louisville, by about 100,000 votes in a race that was ultimately decided by 5,000. So the key for Cameron is to not lose Jefferson and Fayette as badly as the previous Republican candidate did. I think he's going to easily take Western Kentucky because he's got common sense, law and order approach. Western Kentucky likes stability. They like to be able to do business and not have crime run amok, and not have the budget run amok, and not have the government up in their business all the time. And you leave them alone, and they're pretty happy. there are pockets in northern Kentucky, like I said, that are contentious. You saw the recent issue up there with the Dieter's event, and deeply contentious on whether he should go or not go. And like I said, there's always contention with the warring tribes of northern Kentucky, as I call them. I think he's going to easily take the southern part of the state with maybe some challenges around the Bowling Green, greater Bowling Green area. And you'll probably see a map a lot like it looked like in 2019, where it's a state that's almost solid red with a blue dot in Louisville, a blue dot in Lexington, a blue dot around Bowling Green, and maybe a small blue dot in the north. And it's just a matter of if Republicans who already agree with Daniel Cameron will turn out and vote in sufficient numbers, he wins easily. But the challenge is turnout, getting people interested enough in the election to come vote. Because for the first time in more than a century, we have maybe ever, we have a majority of Republican registered voters in the state that just flipped in the last year or so.
That's right.
So if everybody was required by law to vote, they came out and voted with their party registration, Cameron wins easily. But they're not required to vote, and Republicans can get lackadaisical about that, and to their detriment. But one thing about Democrats is whether it's raining, not raining, whether the election's exciting or dull, they turn their people out to vote. They go door to door. They knock on doors. You get precincts that are heavily Democrat that have a 100% voter turnout.
Yeah, I'm going to steal the next question here, Bob. I'm sorry. Let me do this real quick, but I'm really curious about the state of Kentucky as it relates to ballot harvesting, as it relates to early voting, all these controversial changes that have occurred. Mail-in ballots, all these things that have affected the 2020 election so dramatically. How is Kentucky doing on those fronts, and is Cameron concerned about that? If we get a bunch of mail-in ballots, again in this election, all bets are off for a Republican, because it's just I'm sorry, I'll just say it. I think the Democrats cheat on that front. I think they basically go out and ballot harvest, and that's an unfair practice and ought to be stopped. And so, but what are your thoughts on that, John?
My official policy position is I'm against cheating. So
there we go.
No matter who does it, I'm against it. Actually, people cheat in primaries, they cheat in generals. But as a private citizen, I was involved in addressing the legislature on election integrity issues starting in 2019. And we've made dramatic changes in the law in Kentucky since then.
Really?
4 or 5 major bills have come through. So there were a number of irregularities in the 2019 election. The 2020 election was weird all over the country, but here as well. And so now, when you go to the polls in 2023 to vote, it's ID required. Almost everywhere you can get a paper ballot to vote with. There's a couple of counties that have some old machines that are not paper ballot, but you can ask for a paper ballot in 120 out of 120 counties. And I would always suggest that people do that. We do have mail-in voting, as so-called. We actually, it's a process to request a ballot, and the serialized ballot is mailed back to you. They don't automatically mail out any ballots like other states. And it's a very small percentage of the vote, like 5%. And you have to have an excuse for that. You have to say, I'm an invalid, or I'm a service member, or I'm shut in, something of that nature. We have early, no excuse absentee voting. It's the Thursday, Friday, Saturday before the election. And that has been popular with certain demographics, especially older people that don't want to wait in line a long time on election day. But it's a smaller percentage too. I think I'd be surprised to see that be more than 15-20% of the vote on election day. But I would tell candidates, you want to get your in-the-bank votes to vote early. Some Republicans have been hesitant to do that because they think it's going to get them cheated, but there are no votes counted, tabulated, or transmitted until 6 o'clock on election night. So you can vote Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Nobody's going to look at those ballots. Nobody's going to look at those results. Nobody's going to send those results anywhere until 6 o'clock on election night. So I think you have to understand the laws that are out there and vote in accordance with them. So, and then for everybody else, they're going to come in on election day. They're going to have polls opened closer to their home. They can vote like always. And in the most populous counties, Louisville and Lexington is 100% paper. And by the 24 election, we will have finished purging Kentucky of all the electronic voting machines, and Kentucky will forevermore be a 100% paper ballot state.
That's exciting. I did not know that.
And we've made it a felony to connect a voting machine to the internet. There's no transmission of our election night results to any outside entity. It only goes to the Board of Elections in Frankfurt. We've tightened up the rules on, a number of small things to provide security, rides to the polls and that sort of thing. Cameras watching over the drop boxes. So the answer is very few people are doing anything that looks like mail-in voting, except people who should be with an excuse, like I say, military overseas. A few people are doing the early voting, like I say, mostly elderly or people that might be on vacation the following week. I think it's working out well. It's not enormous numbers, but we still got 80% of the people casting their vote on election day on paper, and we now have an automatic recount provision that if the contest is within 0.5%, you do an automatic eyeball recount. I mean, two human beings sitting there going through a stack of ballots, saying that's one for Jones and one for Smith. And we exercised that in the last election. There was a close election in the Lexington area, and they recounted every single ballot by hand. So
wow.
It's been tested, and Kentucky has now risen in the rankings. Heritage now ranks us as 12th in the nation in election integrity laws, where we were quite poor in that regard in 2019.
John, that's really exciting to hear that we've really tightened things up that much. And I was not aware of that. I was assuming we're going to still have these electronic voting machines for the next, for the rest of my life. But that is exciting that we've done a lot of this work. And so I'm glad you shared that. I hope everybody that is concerned about that issue heard this and tell others. Kentucky has tightened up on this, and that is a great thing. So Bob, you had a question there.
No, I know that John and other legislators have worked very hard to tighten up. I feel personally very good about this coming election with regard to the integrity of it. My concern, you all touched upon it earlier, is getting folks to turn out. We know, John, that this election is going to not only have a great focus in our state, but nationally it's going to be laser watched. And considered a preview to the presidential race in 2024. So, my question is, what's going on with regard to getting the messaging out and making certain, you mentioned that, and it is correct, that the Republican Party now, for the first time in my lifetime, I think probably the first time ever, has a majority of registered voters. What's your thoughts about getting the folks out and getting them to the polls and obviously you said it, if they do that, it should be a win for Daniel Cameron.
Well, there is a lot at stake at this election. Elections have consequences, as we're fond of saying. Now, there's only 3 elections in the country this year: Louisiana, Mississippi, and Kentucky. Kentucky is the only one that's going to be perhaps close. The other 2 are not real hotly contested. So all eyes will be on Kentucky. Kentucky results in the governor's race have predicted the presidential race in the last several cycles, both in ways that I liked and ways I didn't like. But I think that the challenge is explaining to people who are spending their life, they're working their job, they're raising their family, they're coaching Little League, they're just busy, and they want somebody else to be taking care of stuff. Those people need to understand that elections have consequences, and you've got to get out and vote your values. And if you don't, you may suffer through what we suffered through in Kentucky for the last 3.5 years. During the pandemic, having your business shut down, having your school shut down, having your church shut down, and having an out-of-control executive who had to have his hands smacked multiple times by the federal court, saying you have violated the Constitution. He's lost lawsuits and had to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxpayer funds back to the plaintiff that said you violated our constitutional rights. We told him the day he did it, he was violating constitutional rights, and he did it anyway, and he continued to do it. And it has been devastating to our Kentucky economy. We've never recovered the jobs we lost. We are on the increase in employment and on the increase economically, but we're not back to where we started yet. We're still some 20-something thousand jobs in the hole where we were pre-pandemic. That was directly the result of executive policies that incentivize people to stay home and not go to work.
That's exactly right. That could be laid at his feet because he was way too aggressive on this shutdown and wanting to lock everything down for way too long, and that was a huge mistake, and that should really be driven home.
And to me, the most egregious was when the big box stores were open, the liquor stores were open, the abortion clinics were open. We deployed state troopers at government expense to go to churches and write down license numbers and threaten people with consequences and imprisonment for exercising their First Amendment right to religion.
Exactly right. Yeah, that should forfeit. That should forfeit the right of him to hold office ever again. That was so insulting. It was a constitutional violation. So
let me throw some encouraging news in here, guys. The polls that I've been hearing about lately show it being neck and neck, and for an incumbent to be running neck and neck, at this point, I think that's real encouraging. With regard to Daniel Cameron and his camp is concerned. And I know his messaging lately, John, has been, you touched upon it a little bit earlier as far as safety, security, backing the police force. And again, I think that's a messaging that should resonate, I would hope, in big cities like Louisville and Lexington, but Louisville in particular, where the crime rate has been absolutely crazy and rampant.
Yeah, I mean, I live unfortunately in Metro Louisville, which I live on the leafy fringe, but I'm still in Metro Louisville, where we have a murder rate, carjacking rate that rivals Chicago and Baltimore, and it's out of control. The problem has not been addressed, but Daniel does have a security plan that closely matches what the legislature wants to do, which is strengthening the penalties for violent crime, especially violent crime using guns, to make carjacking a defined crime. Make sure we're not putting criminals back out on the street. We've appropriated money for a juvenile detention center, because one of the tactics of gangs right now is the gang members that are leaders that are over 18 will go recruit 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old kids to be the trigger men. And they'll go commit armed robbery, they'll go commit murder, they'll commit carjacking, know that they'll get slapped on the wrist as juveniles and released in a couple of years. And once you turn 18, you stay away from that stuff, because you don't want to go to adult jail. So we had no juvenile detention center in Jefferson County, where a bulk of the crime is being committed by minors. And so you can have someone commit murder and be released to go home to his mother, without bail.
Wow.
Not even held. So now we're going to have a 100-bed thereabouts juvenile detention center, and require anybody arrested for a violent crime like that to at least be held for 48 hours while they figure out what's going on and arraign them. And that have been shut down, just for so-called budgetary reasons.
Is there anything on the state level that either the legislature or the governor could do to encourage or rein in sort of the bad practices, or I guess discourage bad practices, or rein in bad practices of the mayors in this state? We have Democrat mayors in our two biggest cities that tend to line up with the more progressive views of law enforcement and of the justice system, which is, if you look at any other city in the country, that's been a nightmare. That's been that's why these cities are. That's why Baltimore's falling apart. That's why Chicago's falling apart. And so, the mayors don't run the state of Kentucky. The governor does. The legislator does. So is there something that could be done that could say, listen, Mayor of Louisville, we're going to take this power away from you, or we're going to force you to do something that is going to be good for this city, which is also good for the state, because Louisville's an economic engine for this state. So, any thoughts on that?
So, we recognize in the legislature we can pass all the laws we want. If the executive branch chooses not to enforce them, if prosecutors elect not to charge people and prosecute people, then the laws really have no effect. So this is actually something we talk about every day. Now we can do that with the idea that we don't really want the more distant branch of government to come overrule local government. I think in general, the theory is that local government is best. You got local control, somebody that people can see and touch, local elected officer. But we also need to protect the rights of people that are being infringed upon by these mayors who are lax on enforcement. They've got to enforce the law. We've got to require them to enforce the law. We've got to provide, prison facilities for the people that get arrested. And I think we need to be, like some other states have done, if you got a prosecutor that won't prosecute murder, you need to impeach him. And, the framers of our Constitution left us with methods to address this stuff. And I would not ever advocate a state takeover of a city, but I do think that the state has to stick up for the constitutional rights of the people that live in that city if their own city government is neglecting them. For instance, I'm working on a bill to ban street camping statewide.
Thank
right
you.
now, if you're a drug addicted person or a mentally ill person or both, which is about 70% of the people living on the street, you just pitch your camp somewhere on a street, under a bridge, on a sidewalk, block somebody's business, and it's very difficult to get those people moved along. People leave behind drug paraphernalia, they leave behind needles, things infected with hepatitis, things with fentanyl on them that can kill you if you're cleaning them up. And it's, they defecate, urinate out on the street in a public area, and you can quickly reduce an area where there's street camping allowed to third world country conditions in terms of filth and disease and petty crime. And, take a look at San Francisco.
LA.
Yeah, LA. I've traveled to California quite a bit, and I was able to contrast the policies in LA versus the policies in San Diego. San Diego does not allow street camping. LA subsidizes it. So there's people everywhere in the streets of LA committing petty crimes, using drugs, leaving their trash around. You drive through San Diego and it's clean. And same state laws. It's a different implementation of policy at the local level. So
that's a great example of what I was talking about. We need a statewide approach that can address these issues that affect primarily urban areas, like street camping, and that's tremendous that that's happening. So is that a law that's been passed and signed? And is it?
No. I'm
just a bill. Okay, well,
yep.
Will you have our support on that?
Not even a bill yet. So
that's true. What's right? Will you have our support, and I'm sure the viewers as well, because Louisville does not need to turn into San Francisco or Portland, and there's areas there's areas where it looks like it, and areas of my neighborhood. I live in the suburban area, Fern Creek. And I've got street camping happening in Fern Creek, Kentucky, one of the most middle-class areas of this town. And this isn't just a downtown Louisville problem. This is a citywide problem. And
well, they had a big street camp out by the airport on the Preston Highway area, and due to months of health and safety complaints about that, they cleared that out, moved out that street camp. So guess what happened? Those people wanted to go somewhere. They don't want to go to the shelter that has rules like you can't bring in your drugs or your guns or your pets or whatever they've got.
Right.
So they went and camped somewhere else. And now they're camping around Outer Loop and Preston Highway and some of the businesses and shooting up drugs in the bathroom, leaving their, their trash and their filth.
That's right.
Out in the parking lot, intimidating customers. So we're impacting people's businesses. So we just move the problem from one area to another.
Well, I'd like to.
We need to ban.
I'd love to invite you back. I'd love to invite you back and have a show on that topic, because I don't think that cities around the country do this well, as far as addressing the homelessness issue. Because like you said, 70% or more of this is not just people that are out of work and just don't have a place to live. These are people that are most of them are drug addicts or substance abuse, or they're involved in some sort of substance abuse, and they need an intervention. And if their families aren't going to do it for them, the state needs to come in for their own good, for the society's own good. If you really care about homeless people, if you care about people that are living on the street, and what a lot of liberals do, a lot of leftists say, hey, we can't touch homeless people. We care about them. We need to let them do whatever. You don't really care about them. You're letting them live in filth, and you're not allowing them to help themselves even. So we need to force rehab on these folks, or force some sort of intervention on this. And what else? What do they do? They just destroy your community, and themselves. And it's so anyway. Well, listen, we're out of time. We're going to do a show on that, John. I will get you back on that because that's a great
Okay,
topic.
I'd love to talk about that.
Yeah, that's
I'd love to get Kevin Bratcher in here talking about that as well.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do a roundtable on that. That'd be a wonderful project. Okay, well, listen, John, thank you so much. This is really interesting to learn about the Kentucky.
Appreciate you having me.
Yeah, and I want to do the map now. I want to get the state of Kentucky and draw it out and say the Golden Triangle, all this. But well, beautiful stuff. Well, listen, you've been watching the station, Kentucky's Conservative Outpost. We appreciate you tuning in. You can keep up with all of legislator John Hodgson's state rep John Hodgson's work online and his webpage, and we appreciate him being on the show. And very good. We'll see you next week.